Hi everybody, today I'd like to review my debate with Vaush on the topic of NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia and show why Vaush's pro-interventionist position isn't justified using a utilitarian framework. The reason I'm doing this is because Vaush has stated on many occasions that he is an act utilitarian. Now, we can show this using a very simplified, formally valid argument of the following form. If NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia generated net disutility for those in the Balkans, then the bombing campaign ought not have been conducted. Premise number two, NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia generated net disutility for those in the Balkans. Conclusion, therefore, the bombing campaign ought not have been conducted. It's a very simple modus ponens argument. Now, since Vaush is a utilitarian, he isn't going to reject premise number one. Therefore, he will likely reject premise number two, which states that the intervention in Yugoslavia did in fact generate net disutility for those in the Balkans. First, he tried to argue that even in the absence of the bombing, the accelerated displacement of the Albanian population likely would have matched or even exceeded what did in fact materialize as a result of the NATO bombing. And he points to the displacement that had already occurred prior to the bombing campaign.
Secondary responsibility for that. It's at least a form of negligence.
So did the intel say, like, the Serbians will stop displacing all of these Albanians unless we do the bombing? Because they could well be saying that even if we do the bombing, there will still be displacement afterwards. But there would have still been displacement afterwards if they hadn't done a bombing, because the Serbians were still doing the displacement.
Now, this is false for a number of reasons. First, according to Human Rights Watch, prior to the bombing campaign, the total displacement of Albanians was about 200 to 250,000, with about 2,000 insurgents and civilians dead. And it was all internal displacement, meaning it had been confined to the Balkan Kosovo region. Now, in the aftermath of the NATO bombing, in the first month, we saw an exponential acceleration in the amount of displacement, and we also saw a qualitative shift from internal to external displacement. And this is something that had not materialized in the 5 or 6 years of the insurgency. An insurgency which, as I noted in the debate, according to George Robertson, had been responsible for more deaths than the Serbian security forces prior to the bombing. Moreover, this accelerated displacement had been predicted by NATO, US, and foreign intelligence services. So, for example, as I pointed out, in this Chomsky essay, he cites an Italian government official who informed Clinton administration National Security Advisor Sandy Berger that the bombing campaign would cause the trickle of refugees to increase to a flood, at which point Berger simply responded, then we'll just continue bombing. US intelligence was also aware of this fact. This is also pointed out in this academic article by Kees van der Pijl in the International Review of Political Economy, where he points out that NATO intelligence and war games had predicted about a 60 to 70% displacement rate in the event of a bombing. Now, if Vaush is going to argue that this displacement would have materialized irrespective of the bombing campaign, which is what he tried to do, then the burden of proof is on him to provide some evidence of that. He wasn't able to do so in the debate. Furthermore, if this was in fact the case, then NATO intelligence, US intelligence, and foreign intelligence services should have been aware of this, and it would have been captured or mentioned in those intelligence reports, and it wasn't. And the reason for that is because, given the previous pattern of displacement, 200 to 300,000 internally displaced over 6 to 7 years of an insurgency, there is no reason to believe, based on that historical pattern of displacement, that irrespective or absent the bombing campaign, you would have seen an accelerated increase in displacement, irrespective of whether or not NATO intervened. And so in this sense, NATO bombing indirectly increased net disutility for the Albanian population. Furthermore, Vaush's entire point is irrelevant because nobody who opposed the bombing campaign, at least not most people who opposed it, were suggesting that nothing should be done as a solution. There were a couple of solutions that had been put forward, two of which I mentioned. One of them was the partitioning of Kosovo along ethnic lines, as suggested by the former president of Yugoslavia, allowing the Roma and the Serbian minorities to remain a part of the Serbian state, whereas the Albanian majority areas would have been afforded some degree of autonomy or even independence. This was actually rejected by Rogova, again something pointed out in the Chomsky essay. The second solution, again, something that I mentioned during the debate, was the presence of an international military force in Kosovo, confined to Kosovo, made up of multiple different countries that were some that were a part of NATO, others that were not a part of NATO. The Yugoslav delegation at the Rambouillet negotiations came on board with this idea towards the end of the negotiations. Again, something that is captured in the Vanderpyle paper and other academic and policy essays as well. Now, when I brought this up, Vaush rejected this proposal on the grounds that the Serbians don't have a right to decide. They should have no say in the negotiations. The stronger nation gets to decide what happens to the weaker nations, etc. Now, I should simply point out that this has nothing to do with utility. He is appealing to principles and rules and arguments that have absolutely nothing to do with utilitarianism. It's irrelevant for a utilitarian as to whether the Serbian delegation or the Russian delegation or NATO or the US is the one who proposed the solution. If the solution was superior to a bombing campaign, if the alternative solution would have led to an increase in net positive utility if it was implemented, and demonstrably it would have, because it would have avoided the bombing campaign and it would have brought an end to the insurgency and counterinsurgency, then that should be the proposal that somebody like Vaush is in favor of, not a bombing campaign on the grounds that the Serbs need to be punished or they should have no say in the negotiations. That has nothing to do, as I mentioned, with whether or not the solution increases or decreases net positive utility. Now, throughout the discussion, Vaush also made the erroneous comparison to Nazi Germany, saying that in the case of Nazi Germany, the Allies just went in, liquidated the regime, demanded unconditional surrender, etc. This is erroneous for a number of reasons. As I pointed out in the debate, there is no evidence suggesting that the Serbian authorities had the intention of genociding or even cleansing the entire Albanian population from the province of Kosovo prior to the bombing. The ICTY had to drop this charge because there was insufficient evidence for it. As pointed out by Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, you have to show the intention of the perpetrators. In the case of Nazi Germany, the intentions could be very easily established. Nazi officials met in 1941 at a secret meeting where they decided on the final solution for the quote-unquote Jewish problem. And even prior to that, in Mein Kampf and speeches and texts and statements, you have this idea of population transfer in Nazi thought. Intention could be very easily established. You can't establish that in the case of the counterinsurgency in Kosovo. The counterinsurgency, while brutal, was nonetheless in line with standard counterinsurgencies as they have been carried out historically. In fact, if you look at the counterinsurgency conducted by Ukraine against East Ukrainians and foreign fighters in the east of Ukraine, according to this Nation article, the tactics were very similar. Artillery, indiscriminate fire, leading to massive displacement of about 500,000 and 2,000 dead just by the end of 2014. Clearly, you don't look at this counterinsurgency and infer a pre-planned intent for genocide, and it doesn't hold in the case of Serbia and Kosovo either. Secondly, in the case of Nazi Germany, it's not as though there was some Jewish insurgency, a nationalist Jewish insurgency that had a mandate of emptying Germany of non-Jewish members of the population and creating a pure Germany on Jewish bloodline. That wasn't at all the case. The Nazis were not fighting a counterinsurgency. In the case of Serbia and Kosovo, that was in fact the case. The KLA, which formed in 1993, supported by the United States and German intelligence, did in fact have a mandate of creating really an ethnically homogenous Kosovo. And this was very clearly pointed out in the Comprehensive Human Rights report that I cited during the debate, which Vaush had no response to, which it has shown that after the bombing and NATO's occupation of Kosovo, hundreds of thousands of Serbs and Roma were basically ethnically cleansed by the KLA in a coordinated campaign of intimidation and property destruction. That also contributed to an increase in net disutility. So, overall, Vaush really doesn't have an argument to make which would demonstrate that the NATO bombing campaign would or did lead to any kind of an increase in net utility for the Balkan population, whether it's the Serbs or the Albanians. In fact, net disutility increased based on several metrics. The accelerated displacement of the Albanian population, which was based on a contingency plan that the Serbs had in case of a bombing, that could have been avoided with one of the alternative solutions. The hundreds of thousands of Serbs and Roma who were ethnically cleansed of Kosovo after the occupation, according to Human Rights Watch, that could have been avoided with one of the alternative diplomatic solutions. All of the destruction of the bombing campaign, which I documented during the debate.
In terms of like the numbers of the conflict, right? Like it's a pretty small proportion of what was going on.
Okay, yeah, so a couple points about that. Yeah, so first, yes, I understand, like, obviously, compared to nuking the country, it was light touch. I don't think that's necessarily, right, the best standard to compare it to. But it's true. So the numbers that were killed, it varies, the estimates. The Yugoslav authorities say 2,000. That's based partially on missing persons data and some coroner's reports. I think that might be accurate. But even if we go with the lower estimates, the lowball estimates, of a few hundred. Obviously, when we evaluate the effects of a bombing campaign, we don't just look at body count, right, or displacement. And we're dealing with a semi-modernized European economy. And so I've just pulled up some of my old data on the effects of the bombing campaign. So, I mean, after the bombing campaign, the IMF estimated that production or GDP fell by 40%, remained there for a few years. And this was because they bombed hundreds of factories, warehouses, fuel depots, unemployment went up, poverty went up. So massive economic damage. They bombed bridges.
What's the point of a bombing run if we don't if it doesn't hurt?
Well, no, I mean, to bomb like hundreds of factories which were state-owned and put hundreds of thousands of people out of work. I mean, that's just one element I'm saying that you have to take into account when you talk about damage. And then they bombed bridges, and they bombed airports, and they bombed a broadcasting center, killing 12 journalists. That is a war crime, by the way, according to the Geneva Convention. Some of the targets, just based on what you're supposed to target, were blatant war crimes. I mean, at one point they bombed the Chinese embassy, killing 3 diplomats, which increased tensions with another nuclear power, right? Like, imagine the outrage if accidentally or on purpose Russia bombed the embassy of another nuclear power. You'd be up in arms, I'm pretty sure. But this happened under the NATO bombing. They use, as you know, radioactive depleted uranium, contaminating the groundwater, oil refineries, chemical plants, air pollution. So all of that damage has to be taken into account. Like,
I think reports on the contamination.
All of that could have been avoided. And in fact, it's clear that Nosh's position wasn't based on any kind of utility calculus. He really just wanted to punish the Serbs. And that became evident with some of the highly distasteful, borderline racist language he was using to describe the Serbian politicians and even just the Serbian population.
Address the fact that Milosevic wasn't even really willing to discuss amendments to these provisions. Because again, they're Serbs, right? Like, this is how they are. They're like mini Russians. And Russians
you don't think that's racist? Like, come on, that's racist. Like, that they're Serbs. That's just how they are. I mean, you are against when you're.
Ironically, in a previous debate he had with somebody named Professor Flowers, Vaush accused her of essentializing race. Yet his language in this debate went well beyond anything she said during their exchange. I should also just say a few things about numbers. If you look at the numbers, as I mentioned, 2,000 Albanian insurgents and civilians were killed prior to the bombing campaign after 5 to 6 years of a violent insurgency. Again, according to George Robertson, the KLA was responsible for more deaths than the Serbian forces prior to the NATO intervention. Furthermore, after the intervention, one of the products or consequences of the NATO bombing campaign was to prolong the fighting between the KLA and the Serbian security forces, so other Albanians died. NATO also struck Albanian refugee convoys on several occasions, killing dozens of Albanians. When the final exhumations were conducted, NATO had to adjust down their estimate of Albanians killed, first from 50,000, then to 10,000. Then when all was said and done, after the bombing, about 4,200 were killed. Add to that the 2,000 killed before the bombing campaign, you have about 6,000. The KLA was responsible for likely half of that. That is not genocide. Not by any stretch of the imagination, certainly not according to Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal, hardly a bastion of critical foreign policy takes, also agreed that this could not be classified or characterized as a genocide. And in fact, prior to the bombing campaign, it was not even an ethnic cleansing. It was basically a ruthless counterinsurgency operation. And the final thing I'll say is that throughout the debate, Vaush was relying on his chat to basically feed him Wikipedia articles and sources. And without trying to be snarky, Wikipedia can be useful sometimes, but what's on there might be correct, it may be false, it may be a misrepresentation, it may be incomplete. It's only as good as the sources cited. And when you're dealing with a complicated conflict like this with a lot of moving parts, you have to turn to the investigative journalism and the scholarship, which are the sources that I was citing throughout the debate. And a lot of the points that I mentioned just in this video here, you can find in Edward Herman and David Peterson's seminal article, The Dismantling of Yugoslavia, published by Monthly Review.